I guess all of you know that I'm Peter Breggin. I'm a psychiatrist in Bethesda, Maryland. I have a private practice, and I teach at Johns Hopkins University in the counseling department, not the psychiatry department. I'm very critical of psychiatry, including at the university I teach at. And I'm the director of the International Center for the Study of Psychiatry and Psychology, which is a network of professionals who support each other in doing what we think is right. And I'll be talking about what we think is right, what I think is right. I've written, as the PA system was saying, a number of books. I think they're up to 14 or so now. But the best known ones are Toxic Psychiatry, Talking Back to Prozac, and now Talking Back to RITALIN. Although my favorite little book, which was published by a medical publisher, is The Heart of Being Helpful, which came out a couple of years ago, which is about my view of how to help people. And perhaps we'll get into that later. Today the subject is one that I find very dismaying, disheartening, discouraging, but also inspiring in the sense of demanding attention. And that is the mass, literally mass drugging of our children that's taking place now. No one has accurate estimates because our government doesn't require any, but there are probably 4 million, 5 million children on RITALIN, and many millions more on all the other psychiatric drugs, because all the adult psychiatric drugs are being given to children now. And it's not uncommon at all to hear about schools where 10, 20, 30% of the children are on drugs. Even 3 years ago, the International Narcotics Control Board, which is very upset about what's happening in America, estimated that 10, 12% of our boys were on stimulant drugs, and it's much higher now. These are incredible figures. This is bizarre. This is the most amazing thing. It's a vast social experiment in drugging kids. The drugs themselves are what's called the psychostimulants. They include RITALIN, which is biochemically methylphenidate, and then the amphetamines. The main amphetamine is dexedrine, dextroamphetamine, and that appears as dexedrine, but also it appears as Adderall, which is a particular mixture of amphetamine, and also methamphetamine, which many of you, it would send chills for your spine to think that your child was using methamphetamine, and methamphetamine, which is sold given to children under the names of Dizoxin and Gradumet. So we are literally pouring into our children drugs that for generations have been viewed as dangerous street drugs, the stimulants. Another drug is Pemelin or Silert. That is now more studies showing that it can kill some children through liver disease, and it's not even thought to be very effective, and probably it's going to be dropping out of use, more and more out of use, and it's not an amphetamine. All these drugs, except for Pemelin, but methamphetamine, amphetamine, and RITALIN, all are Schedule II drugs with the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. This is an international treaty. All the civilized nations, all pretty much the nations of the world, belong to this, and they all rate RITALIN in the same category with amphetamine, methamphetamine, cocaine, morphine, Demerol, the highest addictive schedule of a drug that can be used at all in medicine. And RITALIN has in fact been a drug of abuse on and off in different parts of the world for decades. The first use of stimulants to control children that's been documented was in the 30s. This is not a new idea at all. It's just an idea that the drug companies and psychiatry have finally sold to the public. In 1937, a doctor gave Benzedrine, one of the first of these drugs, and they're all basically the same clinically, to a bunch of children in a mental hospital, and the kids were quieter. And he wrote this up and published it. He talked about how they were tired, lethargic, slowed down, and made a very honest description, but he thought it was positive because these kids were a problem. The Ritalin was approved in 1955 by the FDA, and subsequently, when other forms of it, the long-acting, which is around now, SR, were approved, they simply based the approval basically on the original studies. So I asked the FDA for the original studies under the Freedom of Information Act, and it was so long ago they'd lost them. They literally couldn't produce the approval studies for Ritalin. The drug has gone through cycles of being extremely criticized. In the early 1970s, there was an estimate of 200,000 or 300,000 children at the most, somewhere between 1 and 300,000 children on Ritalin, and that was sufficiently outrageous to some people that Congress held hearings that were critical of giving that many children a drug to control their behavior. And it perhaps slowed things down for a little bit, but my profession has always been impervious to criticism from society at large. Psychiatry has been impervious from the beginning. Many of you, for example, probably think that electroshock went out with cuckoo's nest. We do more electroshock now than we ever have. We are shocking mostly elderly women now. Many of you may think that lobotomy was given up voluntarily by the profession. In fact, it still goes on, and the only reason we don't have a huge amount of lobotomy is that I took several years out of my life in the 70s. That's how I got into reform work. I got so outraged at lobotomy coming back, and they were doing lobotomies on hyperactive children, and I was just outraged. And I conducted an international campaign. That's how my center got formed. And a number of the children were black children, so I have 2 black congressmen, Dellums from California on my board and Stokes from Cleveland. We've grown old together. They're retiring. I'm not. Psychiatry has only responded to force in terms of containing its biological ambitions, its ambitions to drug, to shock, to lobotomize. I say this as a psychiatrist. It's embarrassing to say, and it's simply true. The current tremendous escalation in the use of these drugs has absolutely nothing to do with science. My profession is not driven by science, contrary to all the articles you read in the Denver Post or the Washington Post or the New York Times. The profession is driven by politics, and it has now been taken over by the biological wing. It's sort of like 2 competing parties. On the one hand, there's a psychological party, and then there's the biological party. Well, the biological party was in trouble in the early 70s. And this is a story I tell, by the way, in Toxic Psychiatry, real heavy documentation on the politics of this. And the profession consciously decided in the early 70s that to survive, to compete with the psychology wing, and in particular to compete with female social workers and psychologists who weren't even psychiatrists, to whom all the women patients were beginning to flock in the 70s. See, in the 70s, women got much more empowered in mental health, and yet particularly social work and clinical psychology, also family therapy. And psychiatrists were getting no business anymore. They consciously got together with the drug companies and said, we've got to develop a campaign to convince the public, to convince Congress, and to convince everybody that human distress, they don't call it that, but that these problems are mental illnesses suitable for drugs, and that psychiatrists have to always be supervising and in charge, and that therapy is a side thing. And what they did was begin to take money to finance all the journals. All the journals are now financed by drug companies, not just through ads. They'll finance sending the journals free to the doctors. 90% of the research is financed by the drug companies. All of the major conferences that are held every year are financed by the drug companies. Money is given just outright to the national associations. A number of years ago, when President Bush went to Japan, turned out he vomited on the premier of Japan, and it came out that he had taken Halcyon, a sleeping pill, to regulate his sleep on the airplane. And the question was raised in the New York Times, why was our president getting a pill, Halcyon, that was banned in England for causing, and remember, this is our president going abroad on a mission, banned in England for memory loss, paranoia, and depression. Raised that, why is this happening? So I wrote to the New York Times and I said, consider the fact that the maker of this drug just gave $1.5 million cash, no strings attached, to the American Psychiatric Association. Just gave them this money. Well, they published the letter. This so upset the Psychiatric Association that they made an astonishing confession. They said something in a letter that when I've said it to the press, they've said I'm a conspiracy theorist. They wrote in the letter, Breggin is really off base. We have a partnership with the drug companies. An ethical, responsible partnership, openly in print. And that's the situation we're now in. The drug companies are partners with organized psychiatry, with its leadership. By the time your local pediatrician, psychiatrist, or neurologist hears a thing about a drug, it has been so filtered through that partnership that he or she hasn't the faintest idea what the drugs really do. It's totally filtered and controlled. And at every level, it's controlled, at every single level. It used to be that the FDA was a watchdog of sufficient strength that every year the drug companies fought against funding it. They didn't want it established. The AMA fought against it, didn't want it established. Now, the drug companies and the health providers take out ads to support, encouraging Congress to give more money to the FDA. That tells you that the watchdog is now a corporate pet. The growling days are over. In addition, a number of other factors have been coming into play that particularly come to bear on children. In the 60s, some of you are as old as I am, remember all the books that came out about reforming education, how our schools weren't meeting the needs of our children. There were national conferences, government-sponsored commissions, all of them concluding that the schools were not meeting the kids' needs. What came of school reform? Nothing. When the huge inflation hit in the 70s, when the economy got tight, it all went down the drain. Our schools got bigger, our teachers got dumber, the curriculums got more boring. And some of you may have noticed in the past year there have been multiple exposés about how our children don't read and they don't do math. Now, do we have an epidemic of reading disorders and math disorders? It's ridiculous. It's not what's going on. Another important thing that happened, of course, was that the family began to shift and change. In particular, men began to abandon their families in droves in every class and every race. So the more and more we have women trying to raise boys on their own, which is an extremely stressful and difficult situation. If I wanted to torture somebody, I'd make them a 25-year-old woman trying to raise a 5-year-old boy without a father around and saying, knock it off, kid. I remember when my son Ben, who's an incredibly independent boy, he used to take advantage of his mother so much, and I said to him finally, I said, Ben, you have to listen to your mother the way you listen to me. And he said, but your voice is so much darker. And this is the truth. This is, I don't know whether it's biological or strictly cultural, but clearly men were built more to intimidate than women, are built that way. It's probably part of our function. But for whatever reason, it is extremely difficult, and especially in a society where little boys are taught from an early age to disrespect little girls and women alike. So you take these little boys who have not been taught to respect, and particularly not to respect anybody that's a girl or a woman, and then you don't even have a father raising them. Even if he's in the house, he's nowadays in my hometown of Bethesda, where all the men are there, or a lot of the men, not all, a lot of the men are there, but they're all busy working, making a lot of money, being lawyers, being whatever, doctors. So you have the family coming apart, the traditional family. You have the schools making no progress at all. Meanwhile, the children are becoming less and less respectful of authority in general. They get to see more and more videos and television where nobody respects anybody, and where boys punch out girls all the time, men punch out women, and on and on. And you get them accustomed to high-tech entertainment. You get them accustomed to television. You get them accustomed to computers. And then you sit them in a 19th century classroom with 25, 30 children. And you wonder what the matter is. Why are they fidgeting? Why are they looking out the window? And you take away their breaks and you cut down on their lunch hours. You cut down on extracurricular. And you've got a dreadful situation. Now, this all comes together also with this incredibly successful campaign that has convinced adults that when they're unhappy, they have a biochemical imbalance. I don't want to get into this in great detail. I've written another book talking back to Prozac. Those of you who are familiar with my work know that you'll find more scientific references in one of my popular books than any 10 medical books combined. Quite literally. Quite literally. And maybe not. Maybe you could find one medical book that would have a half or a quarter. Maybe. Unlikely. At any rate, we're in a situation now in which probably the most successful marketing campaign in American history, maybe next to selling the car to the American public, is that they've been sold pills. These are products. They've been sold pills. And they've been sold them on the grounds that they need them. Just like you need a dishwasher, you need this, you need that. But how do you make somebody think they need pills? You have to tell them there's something the matter with them. So we have an ad campaign that says you have a biochemical imbalance. What's the substance? There is none. There is none. Not just a little bit. There's none. There's no evidence that human unhappiness is caused by biochemical imbalances. If it were true, then there's only two ways to look. There's two ways to look at how we got to be the way we are. It's either creationism or evolution. Now, if you look at it from a creation viewpoint, it means that God has the worst quality control assembly line on the face of the earth, that 30% of our children or more have defective brains. And if you look at it from the viewpoint of evolution, you have to say, well, we either evolved to need Prozac or we evolved in such bad shape that we need all kinds of drugs. And none of this is true. None of it's true. I mean, what is true, of course, is that we live in worlds that are incredibly stressful and incredibly difficult and incredibly more demanding on our spiritual and psychological resources in the face of the values that we live within getting weaker and more confused. And this lends to our searching for an answer. And so the answer appears in full-color ads over and over again in the magazines. Prozac, depression, biochemical imbalance. And every editor on the New York Times begins to think it's real. And then he takes enough Prozac, or she takes enough Prozac, she doesn't care whether it's real. Quite literally. And this is the situation we're now in this country. We use 90% of the world's Ritalin. The International Narcotics Control Board considers that America has an epidemic of Ritalin abuse perpetrated by prescribing physicians. And it's not just the kids who are getting the Ritalin who are part of the disaster. This disaster spreads in a number of ways. For one thing, when there's so much Ritalin being put out, it's getting diverted all the time into illegal sources. Parents are getting addicted to it. More high school seniors, according to the DEA, are experimenting with Ritalin than are taking it from their doctors, because it just spreads when there's so much around. We have occasional deaths, like we have occasional cocaine deaths, because Ritalin will stop the heart if you snort it, and occasionally if you just swallow it. I know of cases of kids who have died from arrhythmias just like from cocaine. But there's other lessons that whether or not you're taking the drug, you get being in a classroom with maybe every other friend of yours is taking the drug. You learn about what happens when you step out of line, or you look bored, or you fidget, or you don't smile at the teacher just right, day in and day out. You learn that you're labeled and drugged. This has a powerful effect, not just on the children who are being subjected to the idea that they have broken brains, which is a lie, but also to the kids who are watching it. And you know, you remember the World War II movies and how everybody's always smoking in them? That was not an accident. That was real because the drug companies knew enough, the tobacco companies knew enough that if they could addict the young soldiers, they had them for life. So what's happening now that we're putting all these children on drugs? Why are the drug companies marketing so feverishly to children now? Because it's not just the children's market. It's a lifetime patient. Ritalin is presented as something that corrects biochemical imbalances. It causes them drastic, vicious imbalances in the brain. As an aside, just to give you a little bit of my own credentials, the NIMH is holding in November a whitewash of RITALIN, which it calls the Consensus Development Conference on ADHD and its Treatments. It's just a whitewash. They've just invited everybody they could think of who would support RITALIN, and then they have a panel who listens, objective panel, and then makes a conclusion, which will be spread throughout the press. More and more kids will be on it. Well, the NIH, National Institutes of Health, oversees NIMH, and they looked at this conference and they said, this is so lopsided, so they have forced NIMH to have me as a medical scientific expert on adverse reactions of stimulants. I know my stuff. And if you listen to me in the next 10 minutes, you will know more than the doctor who's prescribing the drug. I guarantee it. Just the next 10 minutes. You will know more. You read the book, and you'll know more than the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. Because when he was pushed by NIH to invite me to the conference and said, you know, you're going to be the scientific expert on adverse reactions, he said, I also want to discuss the mechanism of action from animal studies. He said, we have animal studies on that? We have hundreds. They don't know. They don't care. Oh, it's an upsetting thing. And I think, as an aside, I was talking to a reporter who didn't know me in Boston, was filming me. And he said, boy, did somebody do something to you as a kid? You seem so upset about what's happening to kids. I said, I was a kid once, were you? Oh, my God. RITALIN and the amphetamines. We know basically first how the drugs affect behavior, why they work, and we basically know some of the worst of their adverse effects that we've at least been able to find. Could be many more we can't find. All of the stimulant drugs stimulate, in fact, 3 neurotransmitter systems in the brain that we know of. Now, there are hundreds of neurotransmitter systems. Many we haven't identified. The brain is totally beyond our comprehension at the present time. But we do know that it stimulates 3 of them: serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. This is a very abnormal state. What the drug is doing is forcing the nerves to put out more of this than they ordinarily would. Just like somebody jammed something into the carburetor of your car, only did it internally, right in the middle somehow, right in the brain itself. And then in addition to forcing the nerves to put out more of this substance than they ever would want to, it then blocks the removal of the substance. It's a double whammy. So you're flooding the engine, and then you're not letting the engine dry out. Now, how does the brain react to that? Let me go back to a little elementary biology. Imagine that I'm a nerve cell, and I have a dendron that reaches out to the next nerve cell. Now, in fact, there are a couple 100 billion of these nerve cells, and each one may make 10,000 connections. We're talking about something with trillions of connections beyond human conception, beyond computer conception. But let's isolate it a little bit. So I'm the nerve cell, and I'm reaching out to the next nerve cell. Anne-Marie, reach your hand back to me. All right, now, this wonderful woman is the other nerve cell that I'm trying to stimulate. And her hand is her dendrite that reaches back to me. And her fingers, we can imagine, are the receptors for the packets that I'm sending out of maybe dopamine or serotonin or norepinephrine. Now, when her fingers begin to feel how much is coming in her direction, they don't like it. The nerves don't like it. They know it's toxic. So the nerves begin to cut back on their own fingers. They destroy their own fingers, their own receptors. And in the case of amphetamine, which is given to kids, and methamphetamine, we know they kill the brain cells. We know it. I knew it when I wrote the book, but when I started getting into the more recent, last year's research, more and more studies, it's now accepted by the laboratory scientists that methamphetamine and amphetamine kill brain cells. What about methylphenidate? Well, they're not doing studies on it because the drug company's so powerful. But it's not just a cousin, it's practically the same thing. It's practically the same thing. And we know enough from a few studies that the effects are the same, because it's in fact a universal pharmacological truth that the vast majority of drugs that stimulate a portion of the brain will cause that portion to die back in self-defense. And we're doing this to growing brains. On top of it, we're distorting the growth process. By the way, this phenomena is so significant that you can actually see it under an electron microscope, the distorted shape of the nerves. Or you can grind up an animal's brain and find cell loss in particular areas. This is serious. They don't care. You see, this is the same people who do lobotomy. You think they didn't know they were killing brain cells? This is the same people who still do electroshock. You don't think they don't know in their hearts they're causing damage? They know on some level that giving people convulsions with electricity is not good for their brains. They have to. They see what happens. Now, when you overstimulate the brain, the hypothalamus of the brain, you then send abnormal signals to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland puts out prolactin, growth hormone, the steroid control stuff. And we know that kids don't grow well on Ritalin. Now, you know how my colleagues think of that? They think, oh, a little shorter and a little skinnier. Probably going to recover. When? Nowadays, we don't even take the kids off the drugs. They don't think there's a brain in that body. That's not growing at the same rate either. And God knows what's happening to it when there's a disruption of this growth hormone cycle. Now, we've measured this. We've measured this again and again. It is known. It is so one-to-one that if your child's got a normal growth hormone cycle during sleep, you skipped his Ritalin. I could go on and on like this. We have studies that show when you give a few doses of Ritalin, blood flow to the brain is cut off 20-25%. Routinely. We know this. Does your pediatrician know it? Not a chance. If he read it, he wouldn't know it. It wouldn't register. Moving on to how the drug works. Anything that damages brain function tends to make people more docile. Do you know that for all the kids that we're giving Ritalin so they'll sit still in school, there's probably 2 other kids smoking dope to try to do the same thing, to make it through the day, or drinking to make it through the day? Almost any toxic agent lets people get through the day. But Ritalin and stimulants are particularly interesting. And here we have this whole bunch of animal research, which again, so help me God, the guy at NIMH who's in charge of child pathology had never heard of, and is in charge of this conference has never heard of. And the studies on animals show universally what the drugs do to all children and animals. It has nothing to do with whether you have a disorder. That would be like saying when you saw a drunk on the street, why, he must be susceptible to alcohol. It's nonsense. Drugs affect everybody the same way, basically, accounting for normal human variation, which is, of course, fairly wide, but they basically affect you the same way, whether you are hyperactive, underactive, mean, nice, nasty, whatever. Drugs affect your brain, the machine, in a certain way. It doesn't matter whether you have ADHD or not. And, of course, and this they do know, the experts. They're not going to tell you this, but this they know. This is in all the textbooks. So we can see what happens to a rat, and we can know what effect these drugs have on behavior. First, let's think about what a rat's like. Some people own pet rats. Ever owned a pet rat? They're really sweet. They're very active. They're very inquisitive. They're very friendly. They socialize. They explore. In fact, all creatures, all of God's creatures of any complexity are full of trouble. They're always looking, smelling, trying to get out, not wanting to be caged in. And if they are youngins, they're all driving their parents crazy. And we all watch the Discovery Channel enough to know that mama bears just have to whack their little ones and push them aside once in a while. They never hurt them, but they got to do, I don't mean whack them, but they all got to try to control the rambunctiousness of play. This is about all young. And we used to think it was about children. There's no society, pre-industrial society, there's no so-called primitive society that ever assumed that its children should get up in the morning, move to the center of camp, and sit there all day long while one boring tribesperson taught them about the woods, the birds, and the trees. They let the kids loose and had them taught by a lot of people. This is unheard of to expect this of children. So what happens? Now that I've told you what rats are like, that they're like puppies. What happens if you give a puppy Ritalin? It has two effects. First, it stops all spontaneous behavior. It knocks out exploration, novelty seeking, no matter how you define it. And the animal people have all kinds of ways of defining it. It knocks out spontaneous behavior. But then it does something very curious, perhaps by its effect on the dopamine nerves, and there's a huge nerve center in the brain that to some extent has an effect on compulsive activity. By overstimulating that center, it makes the animals compulsive. And the language is interesting. They call it stereotypical behavior. Instead of exploring, they just look at their paws or chew the bars. They don't even pace around the cage anymore. Instead, they stay in one corner and move back and forth. The behavior becomes what they literally will call in the animal literature meaningless, robotic, over-focused, obsessive-compulsive. It makes a good caged animal. We are making good caged children. Absolutely no question about it, at the risk of their brains. And I've only begun to touch on the adverse effects of these drugs. They often make kids worse because they have such a negative impact on the brain that after the first dose, research has shown, by the evening, the child's brain's rebelling. After the very first dose. And the original research was done on normals. Don't let anybody kid you that there's a difference between how this drug affects normals and other kids. If they tell you that, they're either lying or really ignorant. Nobody thinks that anymore. It's a PR thing. Oh, it just affects ADHD kids. It's a PR thing. So that by the evening, the odds are your child may be worse because the brain's rebounding. So what's the doctor going to do? Well, after a few months, you'll have him on Klonopin or some sedative at night. Or maybe another dose of Ritalin. Then the kid won't sleep. Interestingly enough, there aren't 5 studies in the 10,000 in the literature that ask children how they feel. What does that tell you? The studies that do indicate first that the children lie to the doctors. Of course they do. They tell them what the doctors want to hear. And second, that even though they're lying to the doctors, you can still tell that they basically are made uncomfortable by it. This is not a nice experience, unless you want to become a speed freak. Up your dose and keep yourself going. By the way, all this was known not just from animal studies, but from studies of Ritalin addiction, which now those studies are 30 years old. What happens to people who become addicted to Ritalin, amphetamine, and methamphetamine is they begin to do compulsive, stupid behavior endlessly. For example, they wash a car all day. One of the studies I'll be citing at my NIH conference found that more than half the kids became compulsive when you really look at what's happening to them in an ordinary clinical trial. And the kids would do things like finally rake the leaves. Hey! Well, the kid's out there raking the leaves for 5 hours. Then he's sitting on the ground catching the leaves. It develops self-defeating, meaningless behavior. Now, it's a continuum. If it's just a little self-defeating, a little docile, a little robotic, that's called good school behavior. When it gets extreme, they call it an adverse drug reaction. But it's all adverse drug reaction. The whole thing from start to finish. The drug is not improving the brain. It's one giant adverse drug reaction. But because it makes children docile, compliant, flattens spontaneous behavior, and makes them willing to do rote, compulsive behaviors, we consider it an improvement. Now, I'm not blaming parents. There isn't a parent in the world, unless they've heard me, who has heard this. And by the way, you know, the RITALIN book, I document all of this, and I've got even more, because I put a research assistant on research in the last 2 years now, and we've got a ton more of animal research now, confirming the brain damage and confirming the behavioral stuff. I mean, it's hard to even know how to begin to think about ourselves that we're doing this. It's about ourselves. It's not about our kids. If you look at the diagnosis, and I'll finish on this theme. If you look at the diagnosis, actually, one of my pages, I reproduce the diagnosis, if I can find it. Going to help me find it? See? Here we are.
121 or 216?
143. Let me read to you from the diagnostic manual. Because what you're going to see is that this diagnosis, I'm going to do it without my glasses so my nose will be in the book for a minute, but what you'll see from this is that this has actually been developed over several decades as a list of things that teachers find annoying. Now, if you think, you're going to think I'm joking, you're going to think I exaggerate. Now I'll read you the list. There are 3 different lists. One is for inattention, one is for hyperactivity, and one is for impulsivity. Those are the 3 basic breakdowns. And they go in order of what's called power. The first symptom listed is the one that's considered the most proven diagnostic symptom. Under inattention, I'll go in the order. Inattention. This is number 1. This is the power. This is the disease. Often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, work, or other activities. That's the disease. That's his number 1 criteria under inattention. Number 2 is often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities. These are the things the kids do when they're bored, when they're frustrated, when they're not getting the right attention. The attention deficit is in us. Those are the first 2. The third one is often does not seem to listen to when spoken to directly. I know it. I've raised 4 children. I know what's going on when they stop listening to me. I mean, I got some idea, and it ain't something wrong in their biochemicals. The second one is the hyperactivity, impulsivity, and its hyperactivity. Listen to this. This is the powerful one, the number 1. Often fidgets with hands or feet or squirms in seat. Why would a child do that? I mean, if we didn't believe this nonsense about a biochemical disorder, why would a child squirm in their seat? I could probably, in 5 minutes, have this whole room squirming if I got boring enough. Or if you got upset enough with me. If I was mean. If I attacked you instead of my colleagues. You could make me squirm, too. This isn't one way. Any one of you could make me squirm. Number 2, often leave seat in classroom or other situations in which remaining seated is expected. By whom? Whose disease is it? Is it a disease of expectations? Then under impulsivity, I love this one. I love the first most powerful symptom under impulsivity. Often blurts out answers before questions have been completed. There's a little brat. I still do that. Reporter starts asking me something. I know what you're asking me. Let me answer the question. Finally, I say, stop asking questions. I'll give you all the answers. And I do that. They say, my God, you did. You gave me all the questions I was going to ask. So I don't even interrupt anymore. I tell them to stop. That's how hyperactive I am. This is serious. This is how your kids are being drugged, by this nonsense. This is a list made out by a bunch of guys who sat down and figured out the behaviors that you need to control to make kids into robots in class. Then it got spread to home life, too.